Hello, everybody. I'm Andy Schoenholtz, a professor at the Georgetown University Law Center. Welcome to our second panel of the day, Rebuilding a U.S. Asylum System in Crisis. And indeed, the U.S. asylum system is in crisis. Dysfunction is apparent at the border, and the affirmative asylum program, which often is not discussed, has a backlog that we haven't seen since the 1990s, shortly after the establishment of the Asylum Office. In addition, the Asylum Docket and Immigration Court now exceeds 600,000 applications. Fortunately, we have three experts to help us understand how to rebuild a fair, effective, and efficient asylum system. Each of our experts will make some initial remarks for about 10 to 12 minutes, and then we'll proceed to Q&A. Here in the US, we generally do not focus on the regional nature of humanitarian migration. So to help us learn more about regional protection opportunities and challenges, let me introduce our first expert, and I'm going to introduce each expert and then I'll ask them to begin their initial remarks. We have Alvaro Botero, who is the vice chair of the UN Committee on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families, and the coordinator of the Unit on Refugees and Forced Displacement at the Organization of American States. Audience, you cannot see Alvaro right now. You will be able to hear him. He is in Geneva, and the visual part of his computer is not working well right now, but his audio is, and that's all we need. Second, we have the government perspective, which is always critical to our discussions. We're fortunate to have the senior official at Refugee Asylum and International Operations, known as RIO at USCIS, and a veteran leader of the Asylum Office, Ted Kim, who will be talking in just a little bit. And also, we have to give us the perspective of advocates who understand what is happening on the ground, as well as the larger policy issues that would help the US rebuild the asylum system. We're particularly fortunate to have Laura Peña, who is now the Director of Racial and Economic Justice at the Texas Civil Rights Project. So welcome, panelists, and thank you, participants, for being here. Thank you so much, panelists, for sharing your knowledge and perspectives today. The bios for everybody is on the website if you want to know more about each expert. We're going to start with the regional issues, since the humanitarian crisis affects many countries in our region. So Alvaro, thank you for beginning our discussion today.
Thank you, Andy. It's an honor to be here, and apologies to all the participants since I'm not able to switch on my camera. I don't know if there's some sort of problem with that, but okay, I hope you can deal with me. First of all, I would like to focus in what are like the main challenges that the countries of the region are facing in terms of forced migration and displacement. I think for my experience living in the US and having worked on these issues at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and now in another area at the OAS, it's kind of clear to me that there's kind of an insufficient understanding of what are the root causes of migration and forced displacement from Mexico and Central America. In that case, I would like to mention that there are many interrelated factors driving the migration of people within from countries of the Northern Triangle of Central America, those that are El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, but also Mexico to the United States. Some of the most relevant root causes of migration from these countries include high levels of violence, poverty, inequality, food insecurity, political instability, corruption, natural disasters, and the impacts of climate change, especially in areas such as the dry corridor of Central America. The root causes of migration in these countries are like the ones that are also driving the displacement of Haitians and Venezuelans, two groups that we have also increasingly seen at the southern border of the US in recent years. As I mentioned a moment ago, there are high levels of violence that has contributed to increase the forced displacement in the northern triangle of Central America and Mexico. Non-state actors such as transnational gangs, more known as maras or drug traffickers, cartels, and in some cases also by state authorities are the main sources of violence in these countries. Within this context, some of these countries are also characterized for political instability, and their weak institutions fuel high levels of violence. During the last decade, the Northern Triangle countries have experienced some of the highest homicide rates ever recorded, being some of the most violent regions in the world. According to figures collected by the World Bank, the homicide rate in 2008 was 52 homicides per 100,000 people in El Salvador, and ranged between 23 to 39 per 100,000 inhabitants in Honduras, Mexico, and Guatemala. This compared to the United States, which is 5 per 100,000 people, and while worldwide, the average is at 6.1 per 100,000 people. The extreme violence rates in these countries appear to exceed even the rates of violent deaths in countries presently experiencing armed conflicts. These levels of violence have not been seen since the end of civil wars in Central America. Much of this violence has directly impacted migrants and refugees. For example, with the two San Fernando migrant massacres of 2010 and 2011, where 265 migrants were killed by the Zetas, a drug cartel near the border with the US. So far, there are no convictions for these crimes. More recently, on January 2021, 19 people were found dead, almost entirely Mexican and Guatemalans, intending to cross the United States, having been shot and burned in a truck in bordering Camargo municipality in the state of Tamaulipas, Mexico. Another important factor relates to the socioeconomic conditions of these countries, which has also played an important role as a driver of migration. The countries of the Northern Triangle are among the poorest in the Americas, and according to the World Bank in 2019, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras ranked near the bottom for gross domestic product, GDP, per capita among Latin American and Caribbean countries. On average, people from these countries earn less than $5,000 per year. In the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, as it is logical, the levels of poverty and inequality have also increased in these countries. In recent years, natural disaster and the impact of climate change have also shown to be truly relevant, another of the factors driving migration within these countries. El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Mexico are particularly vulnerable to natural disaster, including drought, hurricanes, and earthquakes. Many of the people that were part of the migrant caravans at the end of 2020 and in early 2021 manifested that some of the reasons behind of their migration was related to natural disasters, especially hurricanes like Eta and Iota. In addition to this, it's also important to recall that many of these countries are recent democracies, which have been struggling with political instability, high levels of corruption, and a small group of elites that control most of the resources in these countries. So, taking all these challenges into account, how these countries can create a viable regional protection system, and what are the best ways to address those challenges. Regional challenges, like the ones created by mass migration and forced displacement, require regional solutions. But the asymmetrical relationship between the United States and Mexico and Central American countries has led to many responses being unilaterally designed by the US, many of which are focused on deterring migration and do not duly address the root causes of migration and forced displacement in the region. In addition, another challenge that I observe relates to the fragmentation between regional mechanisms and actors working on issues of migration and forced displacement. Another fundamental step is for the countries of the region to recognize that they have serious forced displacement situations at hand and their associated root causes. Even when forced displacement was a common problem in many Central American countries during the civil wars, in recent years, it has been particularly challenging to get states of the region to recognize the existence of new forms of displacement. So far, just Honduras, El Salvador, and Mexico have recognized the existence of internal displacement in their territories. Just El Salvador has adopted national legislation to address the situation, but in general, all these countries are in early stages of adopting and implementing solutions for IDPs, which, according to estimates, amount for more than 665,000 people just in these three countries. Another example relates to the creation of the Comprehensive Regional Framework for Protection and Solutions, the MIRPS, in its Spanish acronym. In October 2017, a year that was also the first year of the former administration in the US, 6 countries of the region, Belize, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, and Panama, adopted the San Pedro Sula Declaration, agreeing to work together in the ongoing development and implementation of this regional framework to address forced displacement in Central America and Mexico. At the time, it was interesting to see how some states just identified themselves as countries of transit of asylum seekers and refugees, and just a couple of them as couple of destination. But most of them were very hesitant to identify as countries of origin of IDPs, asylum seekers, and refugees. So basically denying the existence of forced displacement in their territories. At the time, El Salvador decided not to join this framework, joining it later in 2019. This creates a significant challenge in terms of the solutions that need to be implemented to address forced displacement in these countries. In addition, the United States, the major country of destination of asylum seekers and refugees from MIR countries, is not part of this regional mechanism. So while it's notably important, the focus that the current US administration has put on addressing root causes of migration, addressing forced displacement crisis is a twofold process. While it requires long-lasting measures to solve the root causes in the short and mid-term, it also requires systemic solutions by strengthening international protection through access to asylum, complementary protection, and enhancing legal migration pathways for persons not in need of international protection so as not to clog the asylum system. Unfortunately, in recent years, we have seen a large number of measures have countered these needs. Finally, there are significant needs in terms of financial and technical resources for these countries of the region to address the needs of asylum seekers and refugees. Within a context of aggravated by the pandemic, some states are heavily relying on the international cooperation in order to address these issues, circumventing their national and international responsibilities, and also having some sort of wrong understanding of what shared responsibility means when addressing forced displacement. I'll leave it here. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Alvaro, for starting us off with the situation in the region, both in terms of the various causes of the humanitarian movements that we see, and complicated movements, and the stage at which the region is at in terms of trying to develop some type of regional response. And I think we'll try to come back a little later to these questions. Maybe the audience will ask them. I certainly will, to think about how to, what are the best ways to move the governments along to develop this, some regional system, and perhaps figuring out how to interest the U.S., which you said is not part of certain regional mechanisms at this point. So thank you. We'll now turn to Ted Kim, who is the Acting Associate Director at RIO, to give us a sense of how the U.S. government is looking at the asylum crisis at this point, and plans to deal with it. Ted, all yours.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you to MPI for hosting this event and inviting me on the panel. I'd first like to provide a bit of background on my organization, as that clearly informs my perspective. I'm part of, as Andy mentioned, I'm part of an organization called the Refugee, Asylum, and International Operations Directorate, or RAO for short. It's located in USCIS, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, within the Department of Homeland Security. And RAO houses a core of 150 refugee officers who travel overseas to adjudicate refugee claims to try and meet the ceiling every year. We also house a core of over 800 asylum officers domestically within the United States and 11 asylum offices across the country. And they adjudicate affirmative asylum applications and conduct protection screening interviews at the border. And we also have an overseas presence in 7 offices internationally in Beijing, Guangzhou, Guatemala City, Mexico City, Nairobi, San Salvador, and New Delhi. So in the next few minutes, I'd like to talk about how USCIS, and RAO in particular, has grappled with the challenges of the huge volumes of humanitarian arrivals we've been seeing at the border since 2014. I'll discuss what makes these migration flows so challenging to address, as well as potential solutions and the resource trade-offs that are often made to implement those solutions. So first, the challenges of the migration flows at the southwest border. Where to start? I think we can certainly start at the volumes. So looking at the southwest border trends through the lens of expedited removal, where many of these arrivals have been placed through over the years, the number of people subject to and placed in expedited removal has grown exponentially in the last dozen years, going from about 100,000 in 2007 to approximately 250,000 in 2019. And at the same time, and this is really important, the percentage of those who express a fear of return while they are in the expedited removal process has increased exponentially as well, from 5% in 2007 to 43% in 2019. So definitely in the expedited removal context, at least, both the total numbers and the percentage of those numbers claiming fear have grown significantly in recent years. So there's the challenge of volume. There's also the challenge of demographics. We see large numbers of family units and unaccompanied children, which introduce a lot of challenges to the process. Family units present unique challenges because it's really logistically difficult for the government to house large volumes of family units while their protection claims are heard. Accommodations must meet certain requirements under the law, and the period of holding family units in facilities must also be limited. And this is a real challenge to do this in a short amount of time. And we especially saw this in fiscal years 2016 to 2018, when we saw really high numbers at the border, and 46 to 47% of those of that number consisted of family units. So, you know, those years in particular presented challenges with the family units, and continue to do so today. With unaccompanied children under the law, under TVPRA, Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, children must be transferred by CBP to HHS ORR custody within 72 hours. And not only that, but the HHS facilities must release the children to sponsors fairly quickly, or the entire system risks being backed up. And we've seen the consequences of that in recent years, including as recent as this past year. So there are challenges with the volumes, the demographics, and I'd also like to posit there are challenges with our statute. I would put forth that the statute, it has limitations, and I think it's also becoming outdated, if not outdated already. And what I mean by that is expedited removal, the statute, it was implemented in 1997. And the system was really designed, I think, for a different era when we did not see these large numbers of humanitarian arrivals at the border like we are seeing today. It allows the US government, expedited removal allows the US government to remove those without proper documentation quickly, without an immigration court hearing. And the one exception that was built into the statute, of course, was for asylum seekers, who under the statute are to be referred to USCIS for protection screening and detained in the meantime. And if they meet the threshold, they go on, of course, to immigration court, where they can have those protection claims adjudicated. The problem is, in the past 7 to 8 years, the exception has totally swallowed the rule. And as such, as we discussed earlier, the sheer volumes and the demographics have made expedited removal extraordinarily challenging to implement. So those are some of the major challenges that we've seen in trying to implement the tools we have in place to manage the border. Trying to address these challenges have had enormous costs, obviously, to the immigration system, particularly at the southwest border. But as Andy kind of teased at the beginning, it has other costs to the protection system as well. Over the years, in order to address the volumes, USCIS has had to divert its asylum officers from other workloads, including, most importantly, the affirmative asylum workload, to really handle the surges at the border. So even though we have received increases in our staffing levels to accommodate these workloads, there has been a cumulative impact of this resource diversion, and together with the more recent negative impact of COVID on our capacity, this has led to a backlog that, as Andy mentioned, is quickly approaching the program's all-time high in the mid-90s when the program was last reformed. And currently, USCIS has more than 411,000 pending affirmative asylum applications. As I mentioned earlier, RAO has managed many of the resources that are required to implement the US government's protection programs. So the same asylum officers that conduct credible fear screenings at the border also adjudicate affirmative asylum applications. And they will be responsible for adjudicating a third workload, the new caseload outlined in the proposed rulemaking that I'll cover in a minute. Asylum officers are also called upon from time to time to help the Refugee Officer Corps with overseas refugee processing. And conversely, refugee officers are also called to assist asylum officers when there are surges at the border. So I think this is a really important point, I think, for folks to recognize. As policies are designed, I think we really need to keep in mind, as a practical matter, the limited pool of specialized resources that are available to implement them, and recognize that the impact of a protection-oriented solution to address one part of the problem may have unintended consequences for another part of the protection system, again, because of the shared resources. So solutions. Given the challenges, constraints, and costs of addressing the issues at the border, what can we really do about it? Well, that has certainly been one of the most difficult questions to answer. since we started seeing these high volumes of migration at the southwest border since really 2014. I don't think there are easy answers, that's for sure. And it may be that a combination of systemic approaches need to be implemented and sustained over a period of time, as well as a need to be both reactive and proactive. I think, too often we're on our heels in a reactive mode. So certainly for RAO and for USCIS, the proper amount of resources, staffing, facilities, those kinds of things, they are absolutely critical in order for us to have a chance to succeed, because our work is interview based, and at the end of the day, we need an officer, a specially trained officer, and a confidential interview room to do our work. And without those things, all the systems we design won't have much of a chance to succeed if we're not properly staffed in those areas. But resources are one thing. I think we also need a comprehensive, multi-pronged, sustained strategy to address these very complicated issues at the border. There are a collection of activities we can pursue, and frankly, that we have been pursuing at all parts of the government. None of them are earth-shattering or new, and many of them can be found in the administration's current blueprint called Fair, Orderly, and Human Immigration System. But these efforts need to be resourced properly and taken together and be sustained. And as Alvaro noted, solutions need to address, for one, root causes that lead to migration. And I know my colleagues over at USAID are committed to developing assistance for the Northern Triangle countries in particular under this prong. Another approach that Alvaro again mentioned is this regional collaboration in migration management and strengthening asylum systems throughout the region. Over the last few years, RAO has partnered with UNHCR and the government of Canada and the government of Mexico to share best practices and to try and build up asylum systems in the region. And I think more of that is needed. We also need, as discussed before, we also need to ensure all parts of the process are properly resourced. And that includes, up and down the spectrum, CBP, ICE, USCIS, and EOIR. And the addition of immigration judges is certainly part of the blueprint. We also, as the blueprint states, need to provide robust legal pathways so that migrants can come, have different alternatives than just coming by way of smugglers through the border. So, in RAO's world, we've restarted and expanded the Central American Minors Program to provide children the opportunity to receive protection and reunite with parents in the United States. We've expanded it to include additional categories of eligible US-based relatives who can petition for their children. And finally, and there's more to this blueprint, but the one I'll conclude with is it includes a new rule that USCIS will be responsible for implementing. A proposed rule that DHS and DOJ published a few weeks ago that would amend their regulations so that individuals screened into expedited removal who are found to have a credible fear could have their claims for asylum, withholding of removal, or Convention Against Torture Protection initially adjudicated by a USCIS asylum officer through a non-adversarial proceeding as opposed to by an immigration judge in immigration court. The aim of this rule, of course, is to process cases more efficiently through the system so that those who merit protection can get it quickly and those who do not will be screened out more quickly. So again, I think none of these approaches on their own represent a panacea or a silver bullet, but I think taken together, and if people commit to it over the long term, they may represent a path forward for the long-term change. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ted, for getting us into some specifics here about how the Rayo and with this new rule is trying to approach the resources needed. Maybe we'll talk more about resources, what resources it will take to actually get there, and what you're doing in connection with the new rule. And thanks for bringing that up, because I know it's on the mind. I'm already seeing some questions about that from the audience. And audience, feel free to continue putting your questions in, because we're now going to turn to my colleague Laura Pena, who brings us a perspective from having worked on the ground at the border as well as in Washington. So she's got both the larger policy picture as well as a very, very grounded sense of what's happening in the system and where the problems are and what can be done about that. So Laura, turn it over to you.
Thanks, Andy, and thank you to my fellow panelists and to everybody for staying on for this last panel at the end of a long day. I believe I am the last speaker, so I will try and not to go over my time. I'm going to speak to three topics, if I can. The first is border militarization in Texas. The second is collaboration between nations and their states at the southwest border. And the third is what those two pillars mean for access to asylum at the border. So to start with the first one, we must be grounded, and at least at the Texas Civil Rights Project we are, that violence and hatred is built into the immigration system. And I'm going to start with talking about mountain guards. In 1904, the U.S. Immigration Service deputized the first federal agents to patrol the border with an explicit mission to capture those crossing it. The mountain guards were based in El Paso, and they rode on horseback as far as California, hunting down Chinese migrants who had been racially excluded from immigrating to the United States. Now, while the explicit goal of policing immigrants was new in the early 1900s, the policing of Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples had long played a crucial role, in particular in Texas. And that was to enforce white settler supremacy, and that was enforced with terror and brutality. Some of the earliest law enforcement entities created by the Republic of Texas were local slave patrols and the Texas Rangers, founded as a paramilitary force to seize land from the Native Americans. So when the US Border Patrol was founded in 1924, many of its first recruits came from the Ku Klux Klan and the Rangers, who only a few years earlier had massacred 15 unarmed Mexican American men and boys in Porvenir, Texas. So last week, we all watched in collective horror as Border Patrol agents on horseback charged at Black migrants and asylum seekers in Del Rio, Texas. Photographs of the attack show agents brandishing whips against defenseless families carrying food and babies on their hips. For Texans, the attacks are a painful, painful reminder of something we deal with on a daily basis. And that is white supremacist state violence across the US-Mexico border. This should be a wake-up call for all of us, that the Border Patrol and in Texas and across the country remains true to its roots as a paramilitary that exists to police the very existence of people of color. There is, from our perspective, no rooting out this history of hate. There is only cleaning the slate and starting over. Moving to the specific interplay between US-Texas policies and Mexico-Tamaulipas policies. Let's first start with US and Texas, namely President Biden and Governor Abbott. President Biden, like his predecessors, lean into the belief that deterrence is the underlying goal of border policies and recidivism must be met with swift and forceful removal. Governor Abbott holds the same belief system. And he has leveraged the power of the entire state of Texas to institute and create a parallel state border patrol, Essentially, the worst elements of both Border Patrol and the Texas Rangers combined for what is called Operation Lone Star. And in March, Governor Abbott created Operation Lone Star, which was the early framework of the state-based Border Patrol, focusing on arresting and imprisoning Black and brown men along the border, regardless of citizenship. He quickly expanded this operation started in March by declaring a border disaster for now, which I believe is over 40 counties, which is, some of them aren't even border counties, Midland. Now, that area has nothing to do with the border, but yet this border disaster authority is being leveraged, weaponized. He is manipulating state criminal laws, state criminal trespass laws, and colluding with border landowners to prosecute recently arrived migrants and asylum seekers. This is essentially what some reporters have called a novel form of state-based zero tolerance. Now, I'll give you one guess in terms of where in Texas Governor Abbott decided to pinpoint, decided would be ground zero for this state-based border operation. Del Rio. And so here in Texas, at least, we have been watching this train wreck that we saw last week. We've been watching it for miles away and for many months. And I'm here to say that Governor Abbott's actions and President Biden's failure to affirmatively and clearly stand up against them are directly responsible for the mass human rights atrocities committed against Haitians and Black migrants en masse who sought protection in Del Rio last week. One recently expelled Haitian said, according to a news report, "We were rounded up like cattle and shackled like criminals." Reports also indicate that an Angolan man was swept up in the terror and was expelled to Haiti, despite his attempts to clarify that his being Black had nothing to do with Haiti. It's difficult because this is not new. The language, the reflections, the image, it's not new. This is actually who we are as a nation. These are the systems that we have built and we continue to fund with billions of taxpayer dollars. What is different about last week is the level of comfort, brazen comfort of Border Patrol agents to commit these abuses so clearly in the public eye. But why shouldn't they? The president and Secretary Mayorkas have not reined them in. Instead, they've promoted key personnel responsible for implementing human rights abuses under Trump, starting with CBP Chief Raul Ortiz. Policy, personnel is policy. And the impact here in Texas is far reaching, not only for those seeking protection at our borders. No, Abbott's plan is backed by $1.8 billion in state funds, and it's harming people across the state. Here along the border, Starr County, which is nearby, traffic citations for having anything on your windshield have increased by 1,060% since the beginning of Operation Lone Star. Jails are full in these counties. So we're getting it from both sides. That is what's different. I'm going to briefly turn to Mexico and Tamaulipas, and then I think I will be at time soon. In February of this year, we saw here locally, and I'm based in the Rio Grande Valley, it's the southernmost part of the US-Mexico border. We saw Title 42 coming undone diplomatically. And it's basically the state of Tamaulipas decided to interpret a law in Mexico that they could not detain children, which was actually a great interpretation from my perspective. The issue was, so in February, they started refusing to play ball, refusing to accept expelled families with tender age children. And this started in February. What did we do in February here on the ground? We managed Sister Norma, Team Brownsville, Angry Tias y Abuelas. On the ground, we collectively tried to figure out how we could manage the shift here locally. And we begged the administration to address holistically the situation at the border, because if there is one acute point, you know there will then be a second and then a third. And then what's going to happen, which is out, we're seeing now, as Secretary Mayorkas said in his remarks, daily 7,500 people seeking at the border, because it was coming undone in February, and now they're at a crisis point. And so it is just extremely frustrating. Again, like watching a train wreck, really far advice. Now, I am not here just to complain. You know, I think, Tad, you made some really good points that we would agree with. The law is a problem, absolutely. I would also agree, robust legal pathways. Alvaro spoke to some of those, absolutely. Restarting CAM, applaud that effort. But this proposed rule, and this is where all these pieces start coming into play. The proposed rule to increase the number of asylum seekers and bring them to the border is flawed. And it's flawed because no matter how many resources you give to asylum officers, as soon as they are inserted into a border military system, there is no more due process. There is no ability for fairness. The light of day is not possible there. So I would urge policymakers to refuse to continue to funnel money into any attempt to create these policies and execute what I know is very well-intentioned and something needs to be done. But instead of a combination or a collective of actions, to not put more money into this border military zone, because having some asylum officers being placed into what is already an extremely dangerous system is just untenable. What I would suggest in its stead, and I will close with this, the glimmers of functionality that we have seen. The glimmers of functionality that we have seen here on the border are when the United States has turned the baton to UNHCR and actually treated this as a situation more suited for refugees, leaning into that expertise, the policies that across the world the United States plays in, and acknowledge that we need to create those systems of protection across the Western Hemisphere, where climate, COVID, the economy, violence, all of these factors are extremely acute. So I would suggest let's stop pretending that we are going to bring access to asylum back to the border and actually address what is a critical refugee need within the Western Hemisphere. Thank you so much, Andy. Apologies if I went over time.
You didn't go over at all, Laura. Perfectly on time. And thank you for those remarks. You may have noticed in the chat, or you may not have, that you were clearly connecting with many in the audience. But there's so many wonderful questions already from the audience that I think we should begin to turn to those. And then I will also invite each of you, Alvaro, Ted, and Laura, if you would like to ask each other a question, or anybody on the panel a question, don't hesitate to just let me know before I turn to the next question from the audience, because I invited you to join our panel because of your expertise, and I'd like to give you an opportunity to do that too. So, yes. So, Ted, you got a question that was asking you about. I know you're not surprised to have a question, Ted, but you got several. But you got one that was asking, because you think the expedited removal statute is outdated. The exception for asylum seekers was designed for a past era. The questioner is curious about what changes you would recommend to the expedited removal statute.
Thank you for the question, Jessica. And it's a great one. And it really gets to the heart, I think, of our conversation about what is needed to change the current situation, because the current system is clearly falling short. Just to clarify, what I meant to say was, I think the statute is outdated, not because of the exception, but because of the structures it creates, as far as detention and this screening process and all of these handoffs. I think that system worked maybe for the first, arguably for the first 10 or 15 years, but in the last 7 or 8 years, when we are seeing like large volumes of asylum seekers come through the process, the process has trouble absorbing those numbers and the demographics. So, I don't have any specifics. I would just say that if there were an overhaul to this statute, it should be able to address mass migration situations, and not just the pockets of people that I think the original statute was intended for, and not to set up a process where it immediately kind of gets stressed when it sees bigger numbers. So as a practical matter, that's, I think, how I would approach it.
Thanks, Ted. And by the way, if anybody else on the panel wants to comment after any of you comment, feel free to just go ahead, somehow signal to me that you're going to do that, or just do it. That's fine too. I'm glad you reminded me you can actually see these questions as well as I can. So you should feel free to select any questions as you see them come in that you'd like to comment. I just have one follow-up for you, Laura, about, I believe you were talking about UNHCR at the end, and did I get that correct? I was wondering what you're thinking about in terms of the role that UNHCR could play in that system.
I read a little bit of the feedback, and it seems like people like to hear with the on-the-ground reality. So I'll just speak directly to my experience in working with UNHCR on the ground to implement phase 1 of the end of the migrant protection protocols, specifically in the region of Tamaulipas and in Texas, and even more narrowly, because it is such a unicorn, but it is a unicorn that not many people know about. There was a refugee camp in Matamoros for 21 months under MPP, okay? And so many people saw the images of a tent camp, and the Biden administration decided to close that camp. And that experience could be a microcosm of something that could exist elsewhere. And this is why I say that. Essentially, that entire camp became a protected zone. It became a protected zone, which had secondary and tertiary effects. But let's just talk about that protected zone. It opened space for civil society like myself to be safe and go into the region. That was one effect of having UNHCR manage it. The second is it was less about what fears, why you were there at all. It was more about acknowledging the human dignity and the suffering that had taken place for a protracted period of time, and an opening of political will to end that suffering, utilizing the experts of UNHCR to facilitate that process. And in 10 days, I want to say all but maybe 3 or 4 individuals in that camp were processed into the United States with testing, COVID testing. They all got tested, had to have a negative result. Processing with very quick with not only through CBP, but also utilizing the community advocates and NGOs who had for many months worked in partnership with the asylum seekers and migrants who were living in the camp. So when I say it's not just, I know there are challenges in working with international, it's acknowledging that this is actually a situation that's better suited for people who have experience in dealing with refugee processing. But that is a very small example, but it's real, it's concrete, and it can be amplified, I believe.
Thank you. That's a really excellent, example. Of course, many have concerns about, pushing back the border and creating some space. After all, Europeans proposed having, refugee camps really quite distant from Europe to sort of process. But I'm wondering if, any of our panelists want to give a little more thought to this idea that Laura brings up, if that could be done well in a variety of locations. And I'm wondering, if it was done on that side of the border, could it be done on this side of the border and in other locations think about what's going on the southern border of Mexico, for example. Anybody have any thoughts or comments to share about that? Alvaro, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, if that's come up in the discussions about how to create a regional protection system. How would you do that so that, the biggest player in the system still plays a significant role in protection?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to congratulate my fellow panelists for their interventions and the information provided. But regarding that, I think it's even when it seems as a very interesting example of a way to have more protection for asylum seekers and refugees arriving at the border, this Matamoros camp. At the same time, one of the things that should be considering when the U.S. starts to externalize immigration control and measures like this, it's also the risk that asylum seekers, refugees, and civil society organizations are facing when working in places like this. Laura might know probably better than any of us the associated risk of working in Matamoros and in some places of Tamaulipas. I remember clearly when we were talking about when we were working on a report on migrants and refugees in Mexico, that one of the recommendations that we did in that report from the IACHR, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and it was interesting because that was one of the first reports where we were giving recommendations to more than one state, but it's something that is inevitably necessary when dealing with migration matters, was basically to ask to the US to stop removals and deportations to Tamaulipas, because that is kind of like a no-return zone. The challenges and the phases that migrants, asylum seekers face there are like living in a war-torn zone. And that's where many of the measures that has been adopted by the US government in recent years, and not just in recent years, I really like many people saying, this is like seeing history repeating, but many of the measures that are being implemented recently and in previous year are measures that are putting the pressure on the weakest part of the equation. And like, if we can do this in Matamoros, which is a very high risk municipality in Tamaulipas, how can it be impossible to do it in a border zone in the US? Or to bring another regional example, if Colombia traditional country of origin of migrants and asylum seekers, has been able to receive almost 2 million of Venezuelan migrants from 2015 until now, being a country of less than 50 million of inhabitants, facing many challenges related to its very long armed conflict and other forms of violence that we face. How is it possible that the US cannot take more proactive and innovative measures to address migration and forced displacement? For me, it's a matter of political will and how far you want to go with these measures and how you want to commit to your campaign promises and the things that allows you to be where you are right now. So yes, I think the measures from the US government can be more innovative. The burden share should be taken more from the US side than putting it in Mexico or Central American counterparts. And yes, we need to get creative in normalizing or naturalizing refugees and migration movements in the regions. The fact that we keep addressing this as exceptional circumstances or emergency situation is what makes it so difficult to have comprehensive policies to address a phenomenon that has been in the region for many years. Seeing the conditions of the countries of the region before the pandemic and the conditions that they are going to end up after the pandemic, it is very clear that we're going to keep facing those things. But the sad thing is that if the US continue with these policies and not allowing access to asylum or other forms of international protection, people, migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees are going to start to take more dangerous roads, and we will keep seeing more situations like the ones that has happened in Tamaulipas in the last decade. And coming from someone who has been working in human rights for many years, the last thing that I would like to say is that the massacre of the 72 migrants in San Fernando, Tamaulipas, at the border with the US in August 2010, and then the next massacre again in San Fernando, Tamaulipas in between April and May 2011 of 193 bodies, most of them from migrants. And then the next year, the massacre of 49 migrants in Reynosa has been probably some of the largest massacres that we have experienced in the recent history of the whole region. But what is the attention that has been given to that? And that also shows that, kind of the inconsistencies when we are dealing with these lives that seems to be disposable. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, Andy.
Sure, thank you, Alvaro. If anybody has any comments they want to share on Alvaro's points, feel free to. If not, I will move on to another question.
I would just acknowledge the chat is really rich in comments on Alvaro's points.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying the questions in the chats. I'm sorry, I want to apologize to the audience. There's no way we can get to everything, but by weighing in this way, it's helpful to all of us here on the panel to understand what you're sharing with us. So thank you, and please continue to do that. It's one of the political problems with why the administration's focused so much on the humanitarian arrivals at the southern border to as you pointed out, Ted, the unintended consequences for other asylum seekers who arrived in the United States and are waiting for years to have their interviews, is that nobody's trying to imagine yet having a system in place that could make this more orderly, that would also honor due process, right? So part of this is resources. Part of it, I think, is thinking the way Laura was suggesting about what other ways can make this happen, where we can create protection, perhaps with UNHCR's protection zones, perhaps with UNHCR's involvement. But I want to come back to the, figuring out, Ted, what are the resources that would be needed to do this at the border, as well as to be able to handle all the other responsibilities you spoke of. You're going to have, we have now, and you see it in the questions, 50,000 Afghan, cases that you'll be, the asylum officers will be involved in. You'll have new refugee admission cases to work with, and you've got a backlog of affirmative cases. So we know this is all, a significant task. Tell us a little bit more. What does the asylum office need to do this in an orderly fashion, and that would change the way things actually happen at the southern border?
Yeah, the resource question is a real one with the different workloads you mentioned, Andy. Taking them one by one, starting with the refugee program, the report to Congress was just issued last week, and in it describes, the goal to get to 125,000 annual admissions, and that's something we haven't seen before, and something that RAO, USCIS, State Department will all have to ramp up towards very quickly. And for us, that means hiring more refugee officers, hundreds more refugee officers, and we are hoping a lot of this will be appropriated. RAO is currently not, or USCIS is largely a fee-funded operation that does not generally rely on appropriations, so that will be something new for us if it happens. Same for the affirmative asylum backlog. In the president's budget request for FY22, USCIS put in monies for backlog elimination, not just asylum, but other USCIS caseloads. And again, this will be something new, that if it's funded, it will come from Congress, and we will need to hire up. And for the new workload as well, we have already started hiring for the new workload that's coming our way. But in order to apply it in a way that's impactful, we will have to hire a lot more people. And again, the big question mark is whether the funding will come through in our appropriations requests, and how that will happen and come about. Julia's question on the Afghans is a great example. It's a microcosm of, we have this discrete group of Afghans in the United States, and there's a request on the Hill to process them quickly, and will they give us money for that? And if so, in the federal government, as everyone knows, it takes some time to hire up people and train them and get them in a position to adjudicate cases. So all of this to say is that we have a resource intensive process, and where demands are made either by raising the refugee ceiling or by surges at the border, those things come with costs that we need to plan out and resource, and those things don't happen overnight. But those are sort of real life requirements that are needed to tackle these caseloads.
All true, Ted. I'm remembering though, when the first asylum backlog of more 425,000 cases grew in the 1990s. Those were the days where I think, first there were 75 asylum officers, then maybe 150. And I don't know what the numbers was finally to deal with the backlog, but you said there's 800 asylum officers now, and you're hiring more. So there's certainly a significant increase of officers available. And so the question is, I think the issue is thinking ahead about how to, know what it will take to deal with what are, crises that have not slowed down. The humanitarian crisis at the border is still there. It's not going away. And the question is, okay, can it be planned for in a more orderly fashion? And I realize there are a lot of moving parts for you and your office, and you've got funding and other issues to deal with. But at the end of the day, I think in terms of rebuilding, it's those sort of forward-looking solutions. As you said, it's not a happy situation for the agency to always been in response mode. So I'm just wondering if this crisis, I'll just hope that this crisis may be one where you can finally get moved into the real planning that it would take to deal with an ongoing humanitarian crisis. And sorry, it's a long comment, but I'm hoping that that's where this is taken. Laura, I wanted to turn to you for a moment to come back to your observation about the various agencies at DHS and their roles in the system, because there has been some questions and chats about that. I wonder if you want to spell that out a little bit more. What would a more effective, fair, still efficient system, look like, where due process was part of it, with the various, who should be doing what at the border in the U.S. government agencies? Does DHS need reform in that sense?
Sure. And even before addressing that, as listening to Ted talk about the challenges in resourcing and staffing, and some of the comments and frustrations about how staffing is not happening fast enough to address the existing asylum applications in the system, whether it be affirmative or EOIR. And I would just also caution, as their resources come in, as hiring is being done, but really, and this is to Alvaro's point, the externalizing asylum is really, it's a real challenge. Things like the CBP-1 Act, the use of facial recognition technology, the DHS's request to have NGOs utilize their app to process individuals who are seeking access and who are seeking protection. So externalizing in a variety of different ways what are legal obligations for the government onto other actors. I would just, while partnering is one thing, right? Partnering is one thing, but externalizing is another. And we're in a zone where I believe, it's just a shirking of humanitarian legal obligations, the way it's being executed today. And so that's one point. The other point is, okay, so what do we do? And I think Ted maybe won't say it this way, but expedited removal has to go. And that's Congress. Like, that's 1996. It's old, it's antiquated. The foundation of DHS is totally broken. It must be pulled apart and dismantled, and we have to start again. And that is a situation for policymakers, right? And so if you're gonna have to tear it apart to rebuild it, then let's do that. Because the piecemeal approach is a total disaster, and it's completely confusing on the ground, multiple actors, that, then have to be managed from, agencies that are very far away. And so that is where I believe we would need to start. Although I know that's hard for people to really accept, right? Accepting the dismantling, and I'll speak as a border native, DHS, federal funding in the border military industrial complex brings jobs. People, it's a scary thing to say in Texas that you want to dismantle DHS, but it's also, you have to come with, well, then what? If we're not staffing jails, right? If we're not in CBP processing centers, if we're not taking care of unaccompanied children in these detention centers, AKA shelters, then what are we doing and what are the jobs that we have? So it's complex, but I believe with vision that we can do that, and we can reroute those sorts of critical infrastructure questions to things like healthcare. SpaceX is down here, things like vision of getting, to Mars and beyond. So there are real possibilities here, and I would just urge the audience and my co-panelists to not give up that vision.
Yeah, it will be interesting for those who care about these issues to come up with those new roles. What should those roles be? There are certain roles that have to be played, and the question is, who does it? Who are the best skilled people to be working with the humanitarian population? We've seen some developments, with regards to families and unaccompanied children, but this is a large question, and we're still struggling with it. Go ahead, Laura.
Can I just, Abril asked to follow, or Avril Perez, how do I feel about the new proposed rulemaking regarding asylum adjudications by asylum officers here at the border? For the border practice, for anybody here who has practiced on the border, it is, if you've ever represented somebody who is before an asylum officer having a credible fear interview or a reasonable fear interview, that is the only corollary that I can think of. And it is extremely challenging. First, the asylum seeker is not in a mental space to be able to testify to that. And it is because they are so close still to the danger. They are still in the process of fleeing. And so my concern with the proposed rule and, bringing asylum officers to adjudicate fairly and expeditiously is that those two actually cannot go together. And so that is, I know that's not a good answer, but that is my experience.
Well, let's put it this way. It certainly, makes it a challenge to make the current system work. And everybody's been talking about the problems in the current system. So we're trying to get to ways to rebuild in a better way, right? We only have a couple minutes left. So, and you can all see the questions and chat on this. But I want to invite each of you, if you have some final thoughts you want to share with the audience before we end our panel, please go ahead and do that. Alvaro, should we just go in that order? Is there anything else you wanted to add based on what's been discussed or the questions and comments on our chat and Q&A?
Okay, thank you, Andy. Well, it has been, it's very challenging to address the questions that has been placed, and this to say that definitely this is not an easy topic, but I think that much more can be done in terms of creating spaces of real cooperation and not addressing regional migration through mainly unilateral measures. I think that would be important if in the long term the countries of the region really want to address the challenges that migrants and asylum seekers are facing in Central America and Mexico. That that cooperation needs to be sustained in time and not just be think crisis after crisis. And the other thing is, yes, there is a real need of directing the necessary resources for all the required parts to be seated at the table. So this, if as we saw during that intervention, the challenges that the U.S. authorities are facing in order to respond to these challenges that forced migration is placing at the southern border. I just wanted to ask you to think, how are the challenges that refugee authorities and other authorities are facing in countries of origin or in countries of Central America and Mexico? If this is what we are seeing for the US, and clearly there are many shortcomings in terms of the response, the situation for Central America and Mexico, it's much more challenging. So yes, I think it's time to try to address these issues in a regional manner, not just in unilateral or bilateral manners. Taking all the actors to be seated at the table and not just having intergovernmental or bilateral conversations. And that also means bringing civil society actors, which are super important in the response. Mm-hmm. And not just relying most of the responses on civil society actors. I think, yeah, unfortunately, there are many things that should be done and are still not being done. But yeah, hopefully these spaces will create more conscious. And yes, if there is an opportunity to address these issues, I guess there's more opportunity with this administration. So yes, it will be important to try to seize the opportunity with the current administration, because with different administrations or administrations like the previous one, the margin it's almost inexistent. So
thank you very much, Alvaro. We've actually run out of time, but Ted or Laura, I do want to give you at least a few seconds if you have any last words you'd like to share. Ted, do you want to comment?
Sure. I just want to say thank you to my co-panelists and to you, Andy, of course, for hosting this great dialogue. It's been great to see all the questions and the interest in these topics. I think one question that I won't get into fully, but the one that caught my eye that kind of sums up sort of the resources issue for us is Darrell Lynn's question on if we don't receive the appropriations for all the work that's coming our way, what will happen, which will be the most affected? I think that's a really, that's the question, right? Is someone will have to prioritize which is more important. Processing refugees overseas, screening people at the border, and not making them languish in detention longer than they should, or adjudicate affirmative asylum applications, some of whom have been waiting for many years. And so that's a very difficult choice to make that I don't think anyone wants to make who's interested in making our protection system work and making our protection better. So I think that question really kind of sums it up on our end as far as the resources required to operate these programs and to do it effectively.
Thanks so much, Ted. Laura, any final thoughts before we say goodbye to everybody?
Oh, it's hard to be the last one. And I just want to thank everybody on the panel, you, Andy, and then also to the participants for the really robust engagement. And I just want to remind everybody that at the core of these high-level policy conversations, there are real human lives and human suffering that happens every single day. And the cost is so high. And for those who are directly involved in helping to mitigate and manage the Byzantine, hurtful system on behalf of others, I want to thank you for your work as well. And thank you in particular for those that work along the border and are helping to manage what feels like an untenable situation at times. And but it's across the world. And so I'm with you all as well. So thank you, Andy. Thank you for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure.
Sure. Thank you, Alvaro, Ted, and Laura. Sorry we went over and kept everybody a few minutes extra. I do want to say very rich participation, and that really made a difference. There's a great deal of really thoughtful ideas on the chat and on the Q&A. We couldn't get to all or many, we apologize, but it's been helpful to everybody, I hope, of the 500 plus participants who were here today to help us learn more about how to rebuild the US asylum system. So we're going to sign off now. Thank you all, really appreciate it. And I wish we could all applaud for our panelists, but it's just me. Thanks again. Be well, everybody.